have our next presentation by Georgette Zinaty, Executive Vice President, Corporate Class Inc., Toronto, Ontario. Topic, Leadership, Diversity, and Inclusion, Reflections on Building Your Team and Culture. And Georgette has a book available for $25. The proceeds go to a nonprofit. I'm sure she'll talk about it. It's Why Not You? Challenging Diversity and Inclusion Assumptions. This presentation will be, there won't be a Q&A, but Georgette will be hanging around, so she'll do the presentation, and any questions you have, you'll be able to seek her out at the break and at the reception. Thank you.
Clicker. All right, thank you. Hello. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so I wanted to say, this is my favorite slide, and I start with this one every time I do a presentation. And it's actually, I wish it was mine, but it isn't. The quote is actually from a professor from Harvard. It says, diversity is counting the numbers, inclusion is making the numbers count. And I love using this because whenever you work in an organization, and if you're in a big city like Toronto, Vancouver, anywhere in the United States that's big, diversity is a little easier to find in a company, right? So if you think about the main level positions, frontline positions, that's easy to find. The reality is finding that diversity at the senior leadership level is much harder. And the reason is we have to do a little bit more work to be able to do that. Inclusion is much more about belonging, making sure people's voices are heard, are listened to, and that they're at the right seats at the right tables. And that actually requires work, and many companies struggle to do that. They can find the diversity piece maybe a bit easier in the hiring. It's actually the inclusion piece that requires a little bit more work. So one of the things that we often talk about is bias in the workplace. And what does that mean? What is bias? Can you hear me okay? It's coming and going? Yeah, I'm going to move it like this. Just tell me if this is better. So everyone tells me, I love everybody. Don't we all? We all love everybody. I love everybody. Don't you all love everybody? We do. If you're Christian, you certainly should. But if you have a brain, you have a bias. And so 90% of our thought processes are actually unconscious. And so this is the challenge that we often have, because this is in the part of your brain that actually isn't necessarily aware of all the things that you are doing all the time. And because implicit bias is in the subconscious, a lot of the decisions that we end up making on a daily basis in our workplace can sometimes, you don't even realize you're making it. And so we might think intelligence or expertise or more education is going to impact that, but actually it doesn't always do that. You have to be consciously aware of the changes you are making and the decisions you are making in order to manage it. So, we have explicit bias, and most of you are probably thinking, well, I know what explicit bias is when I see it. But let me give you an example. If you're a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, or I don't know what other sports you may like, if you're watching soccer right now, if you have a fan, if you're standing in the lineup at a grocery store or in an elevator and someone's wearing a shirt of your favorite team, you might get into the elevator and go, hey, that was a great game last night. And all of a sudden I'm chatting with someone that I don't even know very well, but that's because they're wearing a shirt of my favorite team, right? That's explicit bias. Because normally I would not have spoken to that person under normal circumstances. So when we think about what is unconscious bias, and it's important for us to be thinking about this a lot, it's because it really is, sometimes it's a motivation, stereotypes that we have about certain people based on our life experiences somehow. You may have had a bad experience with someone from a particular background or culture. You may have, so that kind of transitions into the things that you're thinking about. But it does play out a fair bit in the workplace. So I always like to begin with a gendered lens. A lot of my work is in gender as well. And I always say, if women were a slice of the diversity pie, I wanted to think about the challenges women have. So women have more degrees and multiple degrees compared to their male counterparts, both in Canada and the United States. Yet, they're not well represented in senior leadership roles. So I wanted to think, if that's just a slice of the diversity pie, imagine the barriers when you add skin tone or ethnicity or an accent or hijab or disability or sexual orientation, all of those, and how that challenges the challenges people have in terms of moving through organizations when bias comes into play with hiring and promotion. Now, how many of you are familiar with the show The Voice? Okay, very good. Well, before The Voice, this is an example of a case study. So in the United States, orchestras have 100 spots. They always have 100 spots, the numbers don't change. So they were finding that for years and years, only 5% of the number of people who were in orchestras were women. So they said, well, we're trying to change that, but they couldn't figure out how to change it. So they went to blind auditions. And so what they did was they put up a screen on the stage, and they made people take off their shoes. Now you might think, well, Georgette, why are they taking off their shoes? Very simply, when you're on stage without shoes, you can't hear the clickety-clack of my heel or the thumpity-thump of a shoe. So when they did that, and they had the auditions, the number of women went up from 5% to 30% because they could no longer see, right? Bias. This is another case study. This is one of our colleagues. Her husband actually works in the Army. She's also in the Army. She was a 9/11 survivor. And you'll notice the date says June 25th. That's June 25th, 2020. So this is a case study where the United States Army decided that they're going to add photos to the applications because what they wanted to do was advance people of color. So they said, well, hey, if we have a photo, they're more likely to know that's a person of color, and then we are going to consciously move them forward. So I often talk about moving from good intentions to integration, right? I believe truly most people have good intentions. The intentions are there, but when bias comes into play, that sometimes causes us to make not so great decisions. So they did this, and then for some reason, they were not seeing the numbers translate the way they thought. So they brought in MIT, they brought in Harvard, they looked at the data, and it turned out that in 98.8% of the cases, bias was at play, and that photo being there actually made them make other decisions. So that meant that 200 more African Americans would have gotten promotions from 1 to 4-star generals had the photo not been there. Intention, good intentions, but it didn't work out that way. So I mentioned women in Canada. So just to give you some benchmarks on the C-suite, so in Fortune 500 companies, in 1999, 2% of the CEOs were women. 23 years later, it's now 6%. So I would say glacial. Some people may disagree with how I define glacial. But the other thing I wanted to tell you is if you think, just to give you another benchmark, since 1999, not from, but since 1999, they've only had 17 black CEOs. And this year, there's less than 1%. So it isn't a shortage of talent. So we say, well, you know, every company says, I want the best. I want to hire the very best. Don't we all? Right? But how do you do that? How do you hire the best candidates and retain them? Well, we talk about this. We say how we're going to do it. But we know bias affects our searches because often we're looking for someone like us. You want to say, you know, I really connected with that person. They were so much like me when you're doing an interview. And that's, again, bias at play. So the question is, how often do you say that person was not the right fit? Or is this person going to fit? And that's actually bias again. So what's interesting is our implicit bias, human beings can take 11 million pieces of data at any one point. That's a lot. Your brain is like a great machine. However, only you are consciously aware of about 40 of those. So it's not actually surprising then that you are, like leaning into bias in some way, shape, or form. Of course, because you're not fully aware of all the data that you're actually processing, and then all of that stuff comes in. So I want to introduce you to a term that you may or may not have heard before. How many of you have heard the term intersectionality? Okay, a few of you. So I am not going to define it for you. I'm going to show you a short little video. This is the woman who actually coined the term. Her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. She was doing work many years ago in the United States, and it was very much around women and gender and people of color. And then this is how she used the term. Now that term has used much more broadly today because of all of the different sort of backgrounds people have and so forth. But she will define exactly why she did it. And this is not her. This is someone asking her. Oh.
Well, I have to practice my elevator version of it, but intersectionality is basically the idea that we experience life, sometimes discrimination, sometimes benefits, based on a number of different identities that we have. The basic term came out of a case where I was looking at black women who were being discriminated against, not just as black people, not just as women, but as black women. So intersectionality was basically a metaphor to say, well, they've got race discrimination that they're facing coming from one direction, they've got gender discrimination coming from another direction, and they're colliding in their lives in ways that we don't really anticipate and understand. So intersectionality is basically meant to help people think about the fact that discrimination can happen on the basis of several different factors at the same time. And we need to have a language and ability to see it in order to address it.
So there you go. And so when we think about racism, and obviously, this is a topic that has become much more prevalent, certainly after George Floyd. We've been talking about it for some time, obviously, but with George Floyd, this has really become something that has come, certainly the work that I do every single day, a question of how do we address some of these issues. And so, what we say is this is a system that's been built in, and obviously we've inherited it. Every generation inherits the systems that have been placed, but it does affect us individually, and it is weaved into our daily lives, whether we realize it or not. And so when you are a leader, and you do the work that you do, how do you create psychological safety for your teams? And so this is sort of what I work through with people. So I say, if you want to create psychological safety, you want to create an environment where your organization and people are able to do things and feel comfortable and address them, this is sort of the framework that we follow. So we talk about setting the stage. Well, what does that actually mean? That actually means, when I always say diversity is a fact, inclusion is a behavior that we want to have every single day. And so we want to be able to celebrate our differences because we're all different. We all have more in common than we think. But in order to do that, we need to frame the work and emphasize shared purpose. So if you're an organization and your team is growing, and you have people from different backgrounds, what's really important is to think about the shared purpose that you have as an organization and that people understand that. Because when people do that, then you actually are able to frame the work around that particular piece. The other part is inviting participation. So what does that actually mean? So I often say to people, do you have ERGs, employee resource groups? Do you have committees? Well, that's really great. So, but what are those committees doing? Who do they report to? Are they influencing the decisions at the most senior leadership level? Or do you just have a committee where you have sort of, celebrate certain things, people bring in food, you take the photo op, and then you've ticked off the box, right? So the question is, what are you actually doing to move the conversation forward and actually change your policies and procedures? Before coming here this morning, I was doing a session, a much more longer session than this, and one of the companies, they said, well, we've changed our policies. Everybody we're doing work with, it's important for us to make sure that we have the right policies. And I said, one of my other favorite quotes is, policies don't change minds. Policies are great, but they don't change minds. They keep people in check. So unless you actually believe in what you're doing, you're not going to change the culture. So it's really important to think about that and set up the structures and processes. And what that also means is if you have a diverse workforce, it's great to look at the data. People measure a lot of data. What are the metrics we should be measuring? Fantastic. That's really good. But the question is, are you measuring the right data and the data that matters? And then there's also the narratives of the lived experiences of people, and how does that inform the policies you put into place? And then finally, responding productively. Well, you want to, as I said originally, and you'll hear me continue to say this, I do believe people have good intentions. So if someone says something or asks, maybe isn't meant to be offensive, that's one thing. But when someone is behaving badly in an organization, that does need to be called out and sanctioned. So we talk about fairness and respect, which is foundational to any organization. Value and belonging, so that means that we're all different, we're all unique, we're similar, but we're also very unique, and what we bring into the place matters. And it really allows us to create a sense of connectedness with one another, and how do you do that? And then finally, confidence and inspiration. So if you're able to kind of create this psychological safety in the workplace for people, and being able to get the fairness and respect and people feel like they belong, then you are going to create a high-performing team. So I mentioned different biases. So the Neuro Leadership Institute actually has 150 different types of biases. But what they've done is put them in these 5 different buckets. And so just to walk you through them very quickly, when we talked about similarity, this is where, people like me, and I've been in interviews. Before this current job, I spent 30 years at the University of Toronto in a senior leadership role. I cannot tell you how many times I was involved in interviews and panels. And it was very interesting because, we tend to like people who are like us. That's our comfort zone. Expedience, that gut instinct, it feels right, I need to make a decision. And how often do we do that based on that? But that also assumes that there's assumptions that we're making because of our gut decisions. Experience, so you may have experienced something with someone, whether it was a good experience or bad experience, so that allows you to lean into certain decisions that you have as a result of that. distance. So certainly we saw more of this with COVID. You know, we tend to hang out with people who are in our cubbies next to us or people who are near us. And sometimes we might forget about colleagues if your company has people in different places across Canada or the world. We don't always necessarily include them in our decision making or connect with them as often as we'd like. And then safety, sometimes how we make decisions in terms of how we read that information. You know, if something seems risky, we might be averse, but it might actually be the best leap of faith you've ever had. So it all depends. Now, microaggressions, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but this was a question Rick and I talked about earlier. And it was, you know, sometimes we say to people when you're networking, where are you from? And we think that's okay. And it is, but I would say never lead with that. So the first time you meet me, don't say, where are you from? And I know you don't mean Mississauga. So the question really is, once you get to know someone a bit more, it's okay to ask that question. But if you start with that, it's basically saying, I don't belong here, I'm not from here. And so, you know, I did a TED Talk a few years ago, and I was being interviewed at the University of Toronto for a job. And during the interview, the gentleman said to me, you know, he said, where are you from? So, you know, this is in the middle of interview. You're not actually allowed to ask these questions. And I smiled and I said, Oshawa, because that's where I was from. And then he said, what's your background? And I know he meant my ethnicity. He was trying to figure out, like, you know, and HR didn't say anything, neither did the other person. And I said, well, my undergraduate degree is in English and political science, my MBA is in this, and I could tell he wasn't too happy with my answer. The simple question, and the reason I was a bit cheeky, was technically in an interview, certainly with HR, that is a no-no, right? It is a no-no. You can't ask that question, because if I didn't get the job, I could have said, well, he had a bias. Now, I did get the job, because I had some really great answers, I like to think, but you know, this can be taken in the wrong way. And I know it's hard for people to understand that, because all you're really doing is saying, look, where are you from? So I did a session at Honda a few weeks ago, and I had a room full of people, and somebody said, well, you know, my daughter's fiance, you know, he was asked that. And I said, so what kind of job was it? And he said, well, it was working remotely. And I said, so were they asking, where is he from remotely? Does he have to come in? He said, yeah, he has to come in 3 days a week. So they may have been meaning it that way. I'm not sure they meant his ethnicity. So don't start with that question. But if we've been talking for 20, 30 minutes, you might say, well, where are you from? And I'd be more than happy to tell you where I'm from, because I don't shy away from it. But for some people, it's basically saying you're not obviously Canadian or American or whatever it is, and so you don't really belong here. I won't get into this too much either, but I use this image because it basically says the finish line is the same distance. But if you are a person of color or somebody from a marginalized community, getting to the finish line might be a little bit easier, a little bit harder, than it is for somebody who is not a visible minority. And so there's a lot more roadblocks, there's a lot more challenges, and we sometimes take some of these things for granted. And that's really what this is all about. So how do we disrupt these culturally intelligent strategies? So if you're an organization, these are some of the things that we recommend, a framework to follow. So first, we want to make sure that, you know, we want to seek different perspectives. And we always say we want everybody's opinion, but do we? So we want to make sure that we are actually open to the different perspectives. In fact, some of the most successful organizations have diverse boards, diverse representations, because if you are functioning globally, you actually need those perspectives in order to be able to pivot and function appropriately. We talk about capitalizing on everyone's skills. I guarantee you that if I broke you all up into groups right now, got you to sit down and talk to each other, as well as you might think you know people, there are things that you don't know about someone and their skill set. Whether they play a particular thing, they know how to do certain things, there's so much you don't know about people. So people bring in a small percentage of themselves to work, but there's so much more that they can offer. So we want to make sure that we're capitalizing on people's extra things and skill sets, because that's going to help your organization thrive. We talk about establishing a buddy system. So that may be putting somebody who's newer, or maybe a millennial, with somebody a little bit older, and you might think, well, that's not going to really work. In fact, that actually may create an interesting dynamic. Generational differences for sure, but at the same time, there's a lot of learning that can happen in terms of how we do that. Challenging the status quo, that does not mean pushing back on the boss and being rude. It's actually saying, have we thought about this? You know, who's not at the table in the decisions that we're making? Who should be at the table in terms of some of the decision making? How will that actually impact our organization in a much more positive way, right? So thinking about market growth from that perspective. Fostering flexibility, of course, is very important in learning. You know, you're all here to learn, which is great. And then admitting mistakes and weaknesses. And what that means is if we think about what leadership looked like in, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was very much command and control. Today, this generation actually is looking for authentic leaders who are going to be able to say, I made a mistake, I messed up, but here's how I'm addressing it and taking accountability. And we think that's very important. I talk about feedback. So I often say feedback is a gift. And if we think of feedback as a gift and not as constructive criticism, can you imagine how our world would change? So I often, when I do presentations and training, I tell people feedback is a gift, and I want gifts. I love gifts. Who doesn't love a gift? We all love gifts, right? Don't you all want gifts? Yes, we do. So I say, of course, amen. That's right. So it's very important for us to be thinking about it that way. So how do you give feedback? So I often say to people, if there is a confrontation or a difficult situation you want to have, how do you do that? Well, we use a tool called SBI. How many of you have heard of the SBI? Anybody? Okay, very good. So the FBI and the CIA, and I'm sure three letters in the United States use it, but it really focuses on, if there's a situation, you focus on the situation, on the behavior, and on the impact in order to be able to address it. And when you give feedback, you approach it directly and simply, and you focus on the behavior, not attacking the person. So I'm going to share with you this really great video because I'm almost done. But I do want to, it's really cute and it's funny, but it talks about how we're culturally maybe different, but in many ways, the world is really unique.
So imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block? And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street. This is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? You say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, easy. This is District 8. There's block 17, house number 1. You say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. He said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy. It's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had and realize that the opposite of them may also be true. So for example, there are doctors in China who believe that it's their job to keep you healthy. So any month you are healthy, you pay them. And when you're sick, you don't have to pay them because they failed at their job. They get rich when you're healthy, not sick. In most music, we think of the 1 as the downbeat, the beginning of the musical phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4. But in West African music, the 1 is thought of as the end of the phrase, like the period at the end of a sentence. So you can hear it not just in the phrasing, but the way they count off their music. 2, 3, 4, 1. And this map is also accurate. There's a saying that whatever true thing you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So let's never forget, whether at TED or anywhere else, that whatever brilliant ideas you have or hear, that the opposite may also be true. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
There you go. So I love that video because you can sort of see why, but it does remind us that no matter where you go, there's differences, but it doesn't mean they're right or wrong. And with that, I want to also share with you this. Often we talk about what is being an ally, what is being a champion look like. So you're all senior leaders. There's a list of things here that you can do to do that. But I do a lot of work. I do a lot of work in the gender space. I do a lot of work in the BIPOC space. I run a nonprofit, as Rick mentioned, called Women Helping Empower Women. And I sit on a number of boards. And despite all the work that I do, I say to people, it's great that if you're sharing a post, it's great if you're wearing a t-shirt that says Black Lives Matter. Fantastic, thank you for that. The real work actually is standing up for someone, speaking, moving aside, making sure their voices are heard and included. That's called allyship. And championship is, when you talk about people or you promote them when they're not necessarily in the room. And so it's very important for us to be thinking about how we do that and help, lift each other up in a meaningful way. And I also love this quote: if you're not actively including, you're probably accidentally excluding. So next time you're at a senior leadership table or you're making an important decision, I want you to think about who's not at the table with you to help you advance that mission. Some of you may be familiar with this slide. How many of you seen it before? A handful. Okay. So the first one is really about, everyone being treated equally. So you can see the little guy can't see, but they're all equal, right? Second one is about equity, and that's really where he's got a bit more levers, but there's still barriers along the way. And the third is really much more about justice and ensuring that we remove the barriers so we all have access to everything that we need to do. So with that, I have some closing reflection questions for you to think about. I will be around, but I want you to think about what are you going to take away from today when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what you're thinking about. What is going to be your growing edge in terms of things and takeaways? And if you were to put one action in tomorrow as you lead your organization, what might that be? And with that, I'm going to say thank you. I think I was right within my time limit. The light went off, so I think I did okay. Thank you so much for your time, and I will be around to answer questions. And you can reach me through Instagram, through LinkedIn, and of course through email at any point. Thank you.